everybody, and welcome back to Talking Behaviour, where I am Charlie, and with me is
James, hello.
and we are going to be talking about behaviour by displaying behaviour of talking. And we're going to continue our sort of mini-series on language and communication by talking about teaching language. Just to catch everybody up, we talked about what those two things are kind of last time. Language being the lexicon, the structure, the internal thing that we learn that allows us to understand the world around us, which is kind of limiting to what we can kind of understand or cognition, you know? Then communication is a form of interaction which allows us to pass information between two people, and it involves a person who is trying to transmit and the one who is trying to interpret. Now we're going to talk about something a bit more practical out of the base of them. We're going to talk about teaching language, and we're going to go a bit more into that kind of verbal behavior envelope that we were talking about before with B.F. Skinner. Okay, so verbal behavior is any behavior that a person exhibits to try and communicate with another person, right? You talked about this before and said, is all communication vocal, right? And I said, no, it's verbal, right? Vocal means you are trying to use your vocal cords, you're trying to talk effectively. Whereas verbal behavior is any behavior that you use to communicate. And verbal behavior can be appropriate or it can be inappropriate. It can be articulate and easy to interpret, or it can be obtuse and obscured. In this particular one, what we're going to talk about is that breakdown. And there are many functions that language fulfills. This is kind of what Skinner was talking about in his book, Verbal Behavior. You have these verbal operants, the reasons why you use language to change the environment around you. Okay? Now, I want to be clear, this is one unified model of language. There are many ways of looking at it, and they're all valid and viable. They're kind of looking at it on different scales, okay? So a speech and language therapist would not necessarily look at it in this way, but they're looking at it from a more generalized view and also from a more aggregated view about how people use their language, which is very useful, but not particularly what my side of the science is focusing on, I suppose. Verbal operants are interesting because they show you why we use language. And there is one verbal operant which is the most useful to all people, which we call it the mand, or the command, or the demand, right? You communicate to try and get something out of the environment from another person, and it involves a communication between two people. It's the only one of these verbal operants which is directly useful to an organism or person, right? If your guy, young person who you're working with, or your child, if you're a parent, is doing a behavior to get something out of their environment around them, they are using a verbal operant called manding. Okay?
Yeah.
Other verbal operants are things like, we call them a tact. A contact to the sense allows us to label something, right? This would be me saying this is a microphone, or saying your name is James, right? Knowing what something is and what category it goes into, those are all tacts because they're understandings of this kind of classification of an object on various scales. You have intraverbal, which are relationships between things. So if I say the cow goes and you say
moo,
then you've just completed an intraverbal response. You were able to finish a sentence that I gave, which is relational, but you didn't get told the word moo. Right, you just got given a context and you filled it with the appropriate response. It's an intraverbal response.
Interesting.
Okay. You have text transcriptive. These are basically codic, I think that they call them now, but it's basically the ability to read and write. This is very important if you're going to, as I said, pass language down through the ages, but it's also useful because it allows you to, again, do this kind of like increased function, right? It gives you more options for doing different things. Not only are you going to just be responding to the visual of the thing in front of you, but you might be able to read things in the environment that give you context cues. This acts as a prompt for you to then do behavior, which is appropriate for that context. Okay? So, do you have any questions so far?
I do, but we'll carry on for now, and I will loop back around to them as and when they shoot up and become appropriate.
So there's other things that are verbal operants. There's being able to receptively respond to other people, right? This is basically me saying, can you stand up? And then you following that instruction by doing a different form of behavior. That's not actually a verbal behavior. It's a response in terms of my verbal behavior. And then you have the kind of copying verbal operants, which are echoic to vocally copy something, and then mimetic, which is to physically copy something. These are very useful in terms of prompting other forms of behavior, especially if you're trying to use a more complex procedure, which might start by prompting something with a visual that then becomes them doing it in the presence of something they want. Yeah. So teaching language often is, from a behavioral point of view, teaching people to be able to do these various different things, and then teaching those simpler forms of these behaviors into more complex forms of these behaviors. You wouldn't teach somebody the category of items before you teach them about what basic items are, right? You wouldn't try and teach them to do complex visual copying 2 or 3 step before they're able to copy a single step without additional aid. Right? This is how the behavioral side of things looks at things. We have assessments, right? These big books which have lists of skills which you then check to see what level the person is able to produce them at, and then we can teach them up to a certain level and then move up the scale, right? There are different ways of looking at this. There is the kind of functional way of looking at it, and then there is the developmental way of looking at it, right? The functional way of looking at it is you want to teach somebody to do something to just gain things from their environment, and this is the most practical thing to do at the beginning, almost objectively, right? But then there is a scale above that, which is how will this develop that skill set and then allow the person to function more appropriately inside of that language area. Right? You don't want to get stuck teaching them how to label hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items if they've picked up how to do that. You want to move up and then go on to classification of items, and
you can't just repeatedly go for the short term, and you have to try and at least look at the advancement and where that's going.
Exactly. And then because of the features of people who have a learning disability, or potentially people who have that and have autism or ADHD, you tend to find that that might lead to a reduction in what we call generalization, right? The ability to produce a skill in an untrained area that was trained in a different area, right? This might mean that if you can label something, it doesn't lead to you being able to ask for it when you're motivated, right? I've always thought about it as when you want something, you get this feeling inside, right? That's your motivation, right? And that feeling should trigger you to then go up to the person who has control over that thing and then ask for it, right? But even if you've learned what the name of the thing that you want is, you don't know whether the person's going to say yes, you don't know whether they're going to say no. There's so many confusing and confounding factors in this one that it's entirely possible that if you haven't got the direct and definitive answer, you might choose not to try.
That's almost sad.
Well, all people do it to an extent. It's just people with autism especially will have a better time with definitive things, right? There is a systemizing component to that particular thing where you have an increased understanding of how to sort logic-based information, right? But that also comes with a kind of corresponding deficiency, which is the inability to make these intuitive leaps. And so you don't tend to do so well when you don't understand the model of a scale.
Yeah.
So this also means that often you have to teach every single part of it when you're teaching somebody who has a severe learning disability, and this is why teaching language is quite complicated.
And then you specifically, how would you go about finding a client's level?
I mean, we would conduct assessments, as I said. So those books that I told you about, we have things like the assessment for basic language and learning skills. This basically is where the behavior analyst has taken huge sets of these verbal operant based skills and then sorted them into different appropriate levels. You could take that book to a client and then fill out over a 6-week period potentially. It's very, in depth. What level they are functioning at. And often, if you're working in a very structured institution, this is one of the first places that they start. Is as soon as you come in, they do a 6-week assessment period, they get all of your skills, and then they teach the ones which are critical for you to be able to.
They work where they can add to it and help you the most.
They try and teach you pivotal skills which lead to wider skill growth, right? So that's one particular thing. I would recommend, if you're looking at assessments, the Essential for Living is the one which is kind of the gold standard for the people I'm dealing with, right? In that it's all about what are these key foundational skills right at the bottom, which are really necessary in terms of long life. Tolerating no, being able to wait, being able to request for the things that are most important, being able to make food and drink which is going to sustain you and keep you healthy, being able to exercise. All of this stuff is critical as like a kind of holistic view of person. You need to be able to do all of these things, tolerate lots of changes. And the Essential for Living lays out very clearly what, firstly, the essential 8 skills levels that you should be going for are, and then eventually a whole set of Essential for Living skills.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is quite an expensive book.
Yeah.
So, I'm very experienced, right? I've taught a lot of different people a lot of different things, and a lot of the people that I started working with independently have, gone through those systems before, and so it's useful to have a certain level of experience, but to have the tool is obviously very helpful for you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then do you find that there is very many instances where you have somebody who has gotten quite far on development of the language, of using it, but not very far on the understanding side? So, for example, somebody who knows the words to use, like you said, but they don't necessarily know when best to use them.
Oh,
Is that...
yeah, that's quite common. But I would say that the people who are that advanced often have been able to learn compensatory mechanisms to be able to adjust to a certain extent. If it's very impactful, yeah, that does become a problem. And I have seen people who appear to be very typically developing facing in terms of how they speak, but when you kind of drill down on it, it becomes very clear that there are certain thought errors in the ways that they structure their thinking, and certain ways that they've learned how the world is supposed to work that interfere with them being able to view it functionally. And that can be a real challenge for people.
Especially because, and again, I'm talking from the outside, but I know that masking is quite a big issue for when it comes to making assessments. If you've got somebody who wants to hide their supposed fallings.
I mean, it's kind of dependent. Like, masking is a high functioning thing, right? A lot of the people that I'm working with at the basis are on the learning disability spectrum kind of stuff. There is definitely a period of time when somebody comes into a new setting where there is a novelty to that setting, and it's not necessarily going to provoke all of the responses that it will do after you've been there and gotten bored, and all the things have kind of lost their luster a little bit, right? These things happen, but they're not the same thing as what a high functioning person who has autism does when they go into the environment, and they mask completely by replicating typically developing behavior to be able to chameleon and disguise themselves. If you are able to mask, you often don't end up needing the level of support, but it just has a lot of effect on you, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think masking has a lot of function. It's a very purposeful thing, but I think teaching the world to be able to accept people for who they are is very important.
Of course.
Yeah. Any questions on anything of that?
No, I think that was quite a poignant point at the end there as well.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear it. Yeah, honestly, the practicalities of it is it's very complicated, as all of these things are, and there are lots of different ways of looking at these things, and you can teach lots of different scales of this, right? You can do the speech and language side of things and think about teaching interaction systems, for example, which is more on their kind of side, and that is a very useful paradigm to look through things. Often, if you get someone going purely through a behavioural setting, you might not get the most rounded set of interventions out of it, especially if the people have been working only in behavioural settings continuously. So I'm very multidisciplinary. I think we should be looking at each other's stuff and just mashing it together and seeing what works. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.